Good afternoon. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Kelly Vineyard, and I am your host for today's Checkerboard chat. I am really excited to see a lot of you guys tuning in from all over the country. We've got, some fellow Floridians on. Hi there. I'm from Florida. I'm actually coming to you from my home office here in Gainesville, Florida, which is where I live and work remotely these days. And it's really great to see some of you other guys. I see Indiana and Kentucky, South Dakota, Wisconsin. So a great group here today. And this is going to be a fun chat about a topic that I know a lot of you are really interested in. First off, a little bit about myself. I'm one of the senior nutritionists with Purina Animal Nutrition. And I'm really excited today to have a fellow nutritionist here with us, Dr. Anna Pesta. Hi, Anna.
Hello, everybody.
So I am on the nutrition team on Equine Technical Solutions. And basically what that means is I work with lots of various aspects of making horse feed. I work on formulation. I work on research and development. I work on technical support. I work with our sales force. And I also work with veterinarians. So I love my job. I love getting to work with all aspects of the horse industry. And one of the reasons that's so great is because I'm a horse person as well. I have done a lot of different parts of horse, or been involved in lots of different parts of the industry. Right now I've settled on dressage, and I've been riding dressage for several years. So yeah, I'm a horse person like you. And but I also am a nutrition scientist. So we're going to get into a little bit more of the science today. But first, I'd like for Anna to introduce herself. Tell us a little bit about you, Anna, and what you do and what you do with your horses.
Yeah, so I am also a horsey person in the rest of my life. My job is very similar to Kelly's. I live here in Aiken, South Carolina, and when I'm home in my office, I'm on the phone with all kinds of horse owners from all over the country every day, helping you figure out your feeding program, talking to sales, designing new bags, all of that nutritionist stuff. And then I event, or at least I attempt to in my free time. So I have an off-the-track thoroughbred, and I have a 4-year-old homebred that I'm bringing along and getting started jumping. She might turn into a hunter. We'll see. But just excited to talk about something that I know everybody is really interested in, just from the volume of questions that I answer about this sort of stuff every day. So hopefully we'll leave you with some good tidbits.
Yes, today's topic is all about those carbs. Does my horse need a low carb diet? And interestingly, if you ever happen to send a question or call our Purina customer service line, you may get to talk to Anna. I'm just saying. We have a talented group of professionals that answer questions, and then they also consult with Anna when they need a little bit more technical in-depth expertise. And so Anna does work directly with all of the nutrition and technical support for the Purina horse team. So thank you, Anna, for providing that.
No problem.
Okay, so let's talk about carbs. Like Anna mentioned, this is one of the biggest things we get asked about, right? Anna, what is your low carb feed? What does my horse need a low carb diet, obviously? And so I think it would be good to sort of define carbs first and just talk a little bit about, is it possible to feed a horse a no carb diet? I actually get asked that, or people haven't. I think sometimes people have an assumption that, I need to eliminate all carbohydrates. And I think I want to clear it right up from the beginning. It's impossible to feed your horse a no carb diet. Now, maybe you can have a paleo diet. You can, have practically zero carbs in your diet, and we have a different digestive system. But for horses, one of the key components of equine nutrition is proper digestible fiber for that hindgut fermentation. And guess what? Fiber is a form of carbohydrate. So that's why it's impossible to have a no carb diet for a horse. They need fiber. They need those in their diet. However, there are going to be certain situations where horses do require a lower carb diet. And spoiler alert, there are certain situations where horses do require some level of carbohydrates in their diet. So let's get going, Anna. Can you start off with educating us a little bit about carb nomenclature, ESC, WSC? It can get a little confusing sometimes. So
yeah. So let's just jump right into the dense science portion of it.
Yeah.
So everybody is mostly familiar, or at least I think in the past, everyone has been mostly focused on this term called NSC, non-structural carbohydrates. And, you know, that's basically loosely defined as sugars plus starches. But that is actually a little bit of an outdated way to express these things now. That was always just a calculation that was based off of subtracting out everything else that was in the feed. When you look at it in the lab, you know, everything that's left after protein, fat, fibers, blah, 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 it's NSC. So it was a bit prone to error and not that accurate. Nowadays, with our lab analyses, if we send a forage sample off, or the way that we analyze feed ingredients when we're formulating, we're able to break things down into starches and then WSC and ESC. So it's much more specific and accurate these days. So starches are basically, these are all different complexities of chains of sugars or chains of glucose or other sugars. So starch is a little bit more complex, but not as much as fiber. And it's the way that grains and some plants store energy. Then we get to a more simple chain of sugars. We're talking W and ESC. So the water soluble, well, I'll go in order of the slide that y'all are seeing now. So ESC, these are ethanol soluble carbs. Basically, when you're extracting these sugar molecules in the lab, they come out when you use ethanol. And these are all your sugars, and then a few of some weird little compounds called fructans. And I'm going to touch on more of that in a minute. And then there's another category of sugars called water-soluble carbohydrates. And these are, again, the sugars, and then all of the fructans. So what this means to horses' physiology and what they do when they get in the horse's body and why you would care about them. So sugars and starches are broken down by enzymes in the small intestine, and they're mostly absorbed there, and they move out into the bloodstream, and that's what creates a glycemic response, and that's what triggers insulin to come through and clean it all up, put it in the tissues where it belongs. Sometimes if you feed too much at one time, some of that can spill from the small intestine into the hindgut and can create issues. But then there's some sugars, the fructans, these different little molecules that are not able to be broken down in the small intestine. Horses don't have the ability to break down fructans. It's just the microbes that live in their hindgut that actually break down the fructans. So those pass through to the hindgut and are fermented by the microbial community back there. And those are interesting for these, carb sensitive and metabolic horses, because they are actually the main storage form, or one of the main storage forms of carbohydrates in cool season grasses and a lot of people's pasture grasses and hays. And when you get too many of those fermented in the hindgut all at once, that's what has the pasture laminitis link, and that can set off a whole pasture founder cascade in horses that are prone. So if you had a horse that was especially sensitive, fructans might be of special interest to you. So
that is a very thorough explanation, Anna. Thank you so much. For me, it's helpful, when you're thinking about ESC and WSC, The reason we like to focus on ESC, or ethanol soluble carbohydrates, when it comes to horse nutrition, is that's really the fraction that's going to affect glucose and insulin in the horse's blood. WSC includes those fructans, that you're talking about. And the fructans are not going to have an effect on glucose and insulin response. So if you ever have looked at your feed tag and you see sugar guaranteed on the feed tag, that will be your ESC, because that is what's going to affect the glycemic response in your horse. And side note, if there ever is a feed, and then many of our Purina horse feeds would fall into this category that talk about, being a lower carbohydrate or controlled carbohydrate feed, you will see sugar and starch guaranteed on the tag. And then another side note, a little inside feed industry tip, if that's information that's not on your tag, but you want to know it, you can always email the company. You can always email Purina. We'll give you that information, or any other company should be able to give you that as well. So because it's something we can analyze for, right? We can send it off and test it for. I don't want to pretend like WSC is not important though, because that you had there on the side, if you kind of get a rough estimate of fructans in your, especially forages, not necessarily feeds as much. If you take WSC and subtract ESC, what you have left is the approximate amount of fructans contained in that forage. You have a horse with a high risk of laminitis, you want to avoid forages with high levels of fructans.
Oh, side note, it's mainly in the cool season grasses though. So if your horse is out on coastal Bermuda grass or other warm season grass pastures, you don't actually have to worry about the fructans. So I think a lot of people, that would take a big load off of their minds, and they would stop feeling like they had to,
be very concerned about it. I mean, I'm in Florida. All of the grasses that grow in our pastures are considered warm season. So that would be like Bahia grass or Bermuda grass. And those don't store sugars as fructans. So that, you're in Florida, that's kind of a benefit. Right. But, we feed Timothy hay, orchard grass hay, to horses, of course, everywhere. And those would be considered cool season. So just pay a little more attention to some of those for your laminitic prone horses. And somebody's asking, what is a cool season grass? I learned about this in my, college level forages class, because it's like one of those things we don't talk about very much, but different grasses are categorized into what climate they grow best in. So a warm season forage or a warm season grass grows best during the warm season. So those are more like tropical type conditions, high humidity, high heat. I mentioned Bahia grass, coastal Bermuda grass would be another one. Cool season forages or cool season grasses, they grow when the weather is a little bit cooler. And many of the hays and forages we feed to horses fall into cool season category. I mentioned Timothy, orchard grass, fescue, Kentucky bluegrass. I don't know what else is there. What am I missing? But I would say ryegrass, like if the plant that you plant, that would be considered cool season forages. So, okay, now that we know about nomenclature, let's move on to kind of one of the big questions is, does my horse need a low carb diet? And the bottom line is, when you're trying to figure this out, you need to work with a veterinarian, because your horse needs a low carb diet if he has a confirmed medical condition that would benefit from a low carb diet. So there's quite a few medical conditions that fall in that category. Obviously, the first one is insulin resistance. How do you know if your horse is insulin resistant? You take a blood test, and that's why you need your veterinary involvement. Your veterinarian will draw blood samples. There's several different ways that vets prefer to do this. I would say the key, especially if you're taking a one sample and you want to sort of kind of look at your horse at one point in time, having a fasted blood sample is pretty important when you're assessing their insulin glucose status. You don't want to feed a large meal of grain and perhaps like a oat based or a sweet feed based meal, and then pull a sample an hour later. They're going to have a glucose response to that. That's normal. What you want to look at is what their blood says when they're fasted. And if they have high glucose and high insulin in a fasted state, that's one indicator that you have a problem. So insulin resistance or insulin dysregulation is one. The other might be PPID, or better known as Cushing's disease. That's kind of something we see in our older horses. Again, you need to have that diagnosed by a veterinarian. However, not all Cushing's horses are insulin resistant. So whenever you're having your horse tested for Cushing's, also ask your veterinarian to be sure and assess them for insulin resistance at the same time. Some recent studies actually show up to about 47% of horses diagnosed with PPID have normal glucose and insulin. So you don't want to have to unnecessarily be, counting carbs and being so concerned with a low carb diet with a Cushing's horse if they have normal glucose insulin metabolism. So that's just something to be aware of. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's one thing I probably see the most of. That's the biggest mistake with feeding a Cushing's horse is you put them on this really restrictive diet, and then as it progresses, they start losing weight. And even if they were fat before, they can become harder keeping and lose a lot of muscle. And that really low carb diet is going to contribute to that even more. So
right, it's not
what you're dealing with.
For sure. Let's see, another condition that you might feed a lower carb diet would be PSSM, especially type 1. Right now there's several different types of PSSM, and that's like a whole other topic for a whole other checkerboard chat. But limiting dietary carbohydrates for some of those horses with these tying up conditions can help. So that would be another one. And then let's see. Oh, and if your horse has a history of laminitis, your horse has foundered in the past, maybe it was on grass, maybe it was due to something else. And we typically like to, keep that in mind and think about restricting carbs for those horses. And then just in general, equine metabolic syndrome is, includes insulin resistance, but it also includes this kind of certain phenotype. And I think we have a graph of like a Cresty neck scoring system. I know you guys have seen horses with Cresty necks. If you have a horse that's pushing on a Cresty neck score of 3 or 4, when I see a horse like that, I'm like, equine metabolic syndrome, all my alarm bells go off when I walk in the barn, and, I'll ask about blood work on this horse, and I will definitely want to focus on a lower carb diet for these types of horses. And this is kind of a nifty little scoring system that was put together by Dr. Carter. It's published, and it just sort of gives you a good starting point. Anything from about a 0 to a 2, is not really indicative of metabolic syndrome. But when you start getting 3 and above, that's when I start to worry, when those horses start storing excess fat right up there in their crest of their neck. Okay, so I think I want to also talk a little bit about these sensitive horses, okay? We know that carbohydrate content in their diet matters in terms of keeping their insulin and glucose response low. So when we were developing well-solved low starch, that is a diet specifically meant for insulin resistant horses, we did a lot of research on how these feeds affect the insulin response. And this is a graph that basically shows you how when you feed a meal, and this is for feeding we fed horses a 4-pound meal of well-solved LS, and that's in the brown, diet B, or another diet, diet A, which is kind of in the green here, and that was a 4-pound meal of a kind of a moderate carbohydrate diet, about 18% sugar and starch. Well-solved is about 11%. You can see it matters. Their insulin response to a 4-pound meal will be significantly lower when the meal contains less carbohydrate. So in addition to what's in the feed, meal size also matters. So this is a really interesting result that we found when we did the study on well-solved LS. You notice in the brown, diet B, which is the well-solved, which is, the lower carb feed, we fed a 4-pound meal of that. So it was a larger meal, 4 pounds. we took that 18% carb feed, non-structural carb feed, and we fed 2 pounds of that, so a smaller meal. And as you can see here, their insulin response was actually significantly lower with a small meal, even though it contained, a higher percentage of carb. So bottom line is, you have a horse that you want to, manage their carb intake, feed a lower carb feed and feed smaller meals. Okay. 2 pounds, something in that range. And that's going to really help keep that glucose insulin level down. All right. So we established who needs a low carb feed. Now, Anna, I want you to educate us on, and let's talk a little bit about who maybe doesn't necessarily need a restricted carbohydrate diet.
Yeah. And I was looking on our website because I saw Lauren asked if that chart was available anywhere. And it is. If you go to the Well Solved page on our website, there's a link that talks about a research abstract, and there's that graph and many more. So if you want to see more of the science, go to the website and follow some links. What about the horses who do not have medical conditions and who can benefit from a little bit of carbohydrate in their diets? This would be the performance horses and a few others that we're going to touch on. But performance horses, if they do not have an underlying condition, they need readily available soluble carbohydrate to fuel what you're asking them to do. And, there's different types of work for different, that use different fuel sources, aerobic and anaerobic work, just like there is in people. So, a show jumper or a barrel racer or a racehorse that's going all out for a short amount of time, especially has a high demand for soluble carbohydrate, because when they're running a 15-second barrel pattern, their body doesn't have time to mobilize fat and turn it into energy. They're going to run through the blood glucose that's in their system, and they're going to use the glycogen, that is carbohydrate energy stored in their muscles, and they're going to squeeze that out and turn it into quick energy. And that's what they have available. And even if you're not a barrel racer, what if you're an eventer or a dressage horse or whatever? Every exercise type uses a blend. So you can't fuel really anybody on fat alone. It's all a blend of fuel sources. And that's why we have a lot of different performance feeds with different types of fuel sources built in. And a lot of it is experimenting what works for your specific horse and the feel you like out of them. Honestly, I have switched upper level, like Grand Prix dressage horses, from a high fat and fiber feed to something like an Omeline 500 that has a little bit different blend, gives them a little more soluble carb, because the rider felt like they needed a little more oomph and a different feel out of the horse.
And I can personally attest to that. When I was showing my horse in upper level dressage, I actually switched him to Omeline 500 actually for a couple years, because I felt like the extra carbohydrate in that feed gave us the oomph, I like to call it, that we needed, because it's hard work. These horses need fuel and they need to be able to access it quickly, like you were saying, and you can't access stored fat as quickly as kind of that glycogen and that circulating glucose that comes from sugar and starch.
For sure. Speaking of other special performance horses, Kelly touched on the fact that horses with PSSM, we know that they need a lower carbohydrate diet, but every year we learn more and more about these other muscle myopathies, and there are variations that actually do not benefit from a super low carbohydrate diet. Namely, there's one called MFM, myofibrillar myopathy, and we actually know that those horses, their muscle metabolism actually does a little better, and they feel better and are able to work better if they have a little bit of soluble carb. So just because they have a muscle issue, again, it's not all the same recommendation. And then if anybody out there has or ever runs into a horse with liver issues, the liver is what turns fat into energy through gluconeogenesis. That's for your biochem knowledge. And if you already have problems with the liver, you don't want to make it work harder by trying to turn a bunch of fat into energy. So liver disease horses especially benefit from us giving them the calories that they can readily use with a little bit of soluble carbohydrate. So a sweet feed, omoline, grain-based diet can be useful for them. My last note on that is, it's the disclaimer on all of this is like, of course, there's feeding guidelines for a reason, and we know that there's too much of a good thing sometimes, even for performance horses, and you can certainly overwhelm the ability. I talked about the small intestine being where sugars and starches are broken down and absorbed. If you throw a big meal of those all at once, some of it's going to escape the enzymes. You're going to overwhelm their ability to handle it at once. It's going to leak into the hindgut. The bugs back there are going to get upset because they're used to digesting fiber, not carbs, and you can cause various digestive upset, et cetera. It's not all just the breaking into the feed room scenario. There's variations of it, but healthy horses with no medical condition that Kelly talked about earlier, they certainly can utilize carbohydrate, at reasonable amounts very, very efficiently.
Yeah, and I kind of have a rule of thumb I like to tell people about reasonable amounts. And you talk about a meal size. It's going to depend on what the carbohydrate content of that feed you're feeding. So if you're feeding something like an omoline, grain-based feed or oats, that obviously is going to have a higher non-structural carbohydrate content than a feed like Ultium or a feed like well-solved LS, which are lower. But across the board, if you stick to 0.5% of your horse's body weight or below in a meal size, you're kind of in a safe range, like even for those high carb feeds. So like oats, or like the grain-based feeds. 5-pound meal or less, their small intestine can handle that sugar and starch. I think I did the calculation once on some of our lower carb feeds, like Ultium. I think it's something like 20 pounds of a meal, which is ridiculous. You'll never feed 20 pounds in a meal. But
we're going to be unhappy for other reasons if they
that's problems. It's not going to be starch escape into the hindgut, which is your problem there. But point being, carb content does matter, and meal size matters kind of again. But you keep to that rule of thumb, 0.5% of body weight or less. So 5 pounds or less for a 1,000-pound horse. You should be, in pretty good shape. So before we wrap up here, I know some of you may be wondering, okay, well, what Purina feeds would you consider are, kind of lower carb feeds? And we definitely want to talk about that. But I do want to throw in one last important piece, which is forages. Everybody always focuses on the carbohydrate content of their, concentrate. But what about forage? You really need to be asking yourself that question first and foremost. So forages being either fresh pasture grass or your hays. And it's a very large portion of the diet, right? I mean, a horse is going to eat, at least probably 1.5 to 2% of his body weight per day in forage. And then, a much smaller proportion in concentrate. So forages will range in non-structural carb content. The best way to know is to send it off for testing. There are a lot of forage testing facilities out there. And if you have an insulin-resistant horse or you have a horse with a medical condition, it's a good idea to have an idea of what you're working with and send it off for testing. If you're only buying small batches of hay at a time, that can get challenging if it's changing a lot. But if you get large deliveries of hay or kind of have a large batch, it's really worth the investment. So yes, get your hay tested. Kind of one of the benchmarks that's out there in the industry. We talk about looking for forages, 12% or below non-structural carb is sort of recommended for these sensitive horses. But that's not always possible to find that, but you can do something to help that situation, which is soaking. Soaking hay does reduce some of the sugars and starches. And the ideal soaking time would be somewhere between 15 and 60 minutes, 50 minutes to an hour. Will reduce some of those sugars and starches. They'll leach out into the water. Don't offer the water to your horse. That's just sugar water. So make sure you drain it off and then feed the soaked hay. and that will help. You know, if you test your hay and it's a little bit above that 12, or in most cases, what I see, you know, you can't test your hay, so you want to be safe, so you soak it. That works. Now, if you go beyond 60 minutes of soaking, that's probably not going to help you out. Yes, it may get a little more sugar and starch out, but it's also going to reduce palatability. The horses tend to not like it as much, and it's also going to reduce other nutrients and minerals. So kind of that 15 to 60 minute window is sort of the ideal slot. Okay. So let's talk about concentrate now, and let's talk about from Purina, what are some of the options that we have that, you know, we consider to be, you know, lower in non-structural carb and appropriate for some of these sensitive horses. Anna, can you kind of go over some of that for us?
Yeah, I'll give y'all the overview of some of the options that might be appropriate. So if we're dealing with the bulk of the fat, easy keeping, metabolic air ferns that don't really even need feed, they need a ration balancer. They need Enrich Plus, is ours. And that's how you put all their vitamin, mineral, amino acid requirements without all the extra calories and sugars and starches, pack all the nutrients into a pound on a 1,000-pound horse, you know, at maintenance. And then you can probably also going to have to pay attention to your, you know, how much hay they're eating and how sugary the hay is to manage their weight and their potential metabolic syndrome. But as you can see, when we're developing a diet for these sensitive horses, we actually do a lot of these glucose and insulin dynamics research studies where we will put horses on long-term feeding trials and then pull blood at different time points. And you can see here that a horse eating a 1-pound meal of Enrich Plus, his glucose and insulin responses, these are actually not even getting outside of fasting ranges. So it's not even a blip on their radar in terms of affecting their, you know, metabolism. So I think that's a very, very safe option for even the most sensitive of sensitive horses. If they're not air ferns, or if they need some feed, and there are certainly insulin resistant horses who aren't fat and who are working and who need some feed, Well-Solve LS is, like Kelly talked about earlier, probably our most, you know, strictly controlled diet for the most sensitive horses, those horses that have, you know, had a history of laminitis, that sort of thing, but they do need feed. I like to use, you know, the Well-Solve products. And then we have a wide range of performance type feeds. If you've got a performance horse, or, you know, a Cushing horse that needs calories, or an older horse who's a little sugar sensitive but still needs some calories, we've got, you know, a range. And that would start with Strategy Healthy Edge. That is a low to moderate calorie, you know, feed for a wide range of types of horses that's really low in sugar and starch. And we did the same type of glucose and insulin response work with the blood work at the research farm as we did on Well-Solve and Enrich. And we feel very comfortable that, you know, if he's the kind of horse that needs 4, 5, 6 pounds, you know, some feed, Strategy Healthy Edge is a really, really nice option. It's a little added fat. It's got Outlast built in. Good choice. Then if you need some calories, we go up from there. We get into the moderate to higher calorie feeds. We've got Senior Active, Ultium Gastric Care, Ultium Competition, Impact Pro Performance. We've got a lot of options that are low sugar starch, higher calorie feeds. You got some choices depending on your preferences, how many calories you really need, etc. And there's a handy bar chart there. It's in the back of all of our brochures, and it shows you all of those feeds that are in that oblong bar there are considered low in sugar and starches. So lots of choices. It's kind of job security for us to figure out exactly which way to recommend for certain situations, but there's a lot of choices there. speaking of that, there are a lot of ways to get to a low carbohydrate diet. If you say, okay, maybe my horse has an issue, or maybe he doesn't, maybe he's a performance horse who's healthy, but I feel like I want to put him on a lower carbohydrate diet, or maybe he's got PSSM or something like that. Which way do you go? And a lot of people, tend to say, okay, I'm going to go to the feed store, I'm going to go online and just find the feed with the lowest number on the tag for sugars and starches. I want to find that 12 or 10% or as low as possible low carb performance feed. And that is not always the right answer, because carbs aren't all that's in the feed. That doesn't tell you if that's the best choice for you, because calorie density, how many calories come along with how many carbs, is really important. So I put together some calculations that I like to share.
There's a lot of math on one slide, Anna.
A lot of math on one slide. I'll give you the gist. Say you had a performance horse who looks good, feels good, performs right on the amount of calories that is in 5 pounds of strategy GX, regular strategy. He was eating 5 pounds. So we want to put the same number of total calories into him in a lower sugar and starch way. So that 5 pounds was providing 1.25 pounds of combined sugar starch and 7,500 calories. If we look at the other ways to do it, you might say, oh, well, I need to go well-solve LS because it's got that nice 11% sugar and starch number on the tag, but it's only 1,200 calories. So you have to feed a little more. I can't even see that number on the screen, but I'm pretty sure it's 6.25 pounds.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, you have to feed more well-solved than you did strategy to keep him looking right. But yes, you're going to put like half the amount of sugar and starch in the horse than you were before. So yes, that can be a successful program. And for your sensitive PSSM guys, something like that would be a good move. But then we've got other options. So as you move down the line and the feeds get higher in calorie, even though they get higher in sugar and starches, they're still in the grand scheme low, but they're higher calorie density. Your meal size as you move along finally falls below 5 pounds that you used to have to eat. So your meal size is going smaller, which, as Kelly showed you, is part of the equation. And when we get all the way down the line to Ultium competition, it's 1,900 calories a pound, and even though it's 16% combined sugar and starch, you only have to feed 3.9 pounds a day, and you end up putting less sugar and starch in the horse than you were on well-solved LS. So
wow, that's kind of gathering news right there. You can feed higher sugar and starch feed and end up with lower total carbs coming into the diet when you base it on calories, which is really the most accurate way to go about that.
Yeah, and if that wasn't up for long enough and you need to see it again, so Alyssa's asking if that slide's available. When this is recorded, slide back in the timestamp to that and take a screenshot.
And maybe we can do that in the comments later too.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's such an important concept, about just kind of figuring out the calories and the total amount of carbs coming in to meet your calorie requirement. Because it's going to be different. A lot of the low carb feeds out there sometimes are lower calorie too. And if you have a performance horse, that can be a little bit of a challenge.
For sure.
For a horse that needs more calories. Okay, well, I think that we've had some really good conversation here, and I appreciate everyone checking in here. Before we wrap up, I did see a couple little questions that I wanted to just comment on. Someone was asking from Maine about impact textured feeds, and she's having trouble finding them. I would say, look for the Omalines. If you can't find the impact textured there in your area. Omaline textured feeds are kind of grain based. They may be something similar to what you're looking for. Horses love textured feeds, Anna. Carbs taste good to horses. Don't be afraid of grain based feeds, especially if you have a picky horse or you have even sick horses. I use these a lot with sick horses, and they're a great option. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, a lot of times with the old guys, like it's more important at a certain point, it's more important that they eat rather than what they eat. So if he needs to eat something, give him what he wants to eat. Don't be obsessed with his blood sugar at a certain point. I mean, he's like 75 in terms of people years. Like let him eat some feed.
Let him have a cake.
Yeah, and Omelines are really good for that.
Yeah. I see there's a question about putting weight on a skinny horse. I think we have a whole nother checkerboard chat on skinny horses, or at least some of those frequently asked questions. You look for your highest fat, highest calorie feeds. The Ultium feeds are pretty much our highest. She mentioned Ultium Competition. That's our highest calorie feed that we have. That's really, of course, focus on good quality forage. And then when you need to bring in the concentrate, get the high calorie, high fat feeds can work well for putting weight on horses. Let's see, someone asked about feeding mules. There is research out there looking at the specific requirements of mules. And I would say, from the Purina side, we don't have a herd of mules that we do research on, unfortunately. But that's one of the reasons why we do field trials, and we can, work with populations of equids that we don't have. Mules are typically more efficient than your average horse in terms of like calorie needs. But you can feed mules very similarly to horses overall. Sometimes they're a little more susceptible to some of these like insulin issues, and they can be easier keepers. So that's something to be aware of. But yeah, thank you guys all for tuning in today. If you continue to have questions, reach out to us via customer service. And also let us know, are there other topics that you'd like for us in Checkerboard Chat? We love to get into the science of nutrition, or we also would like to do something fun and, maybe not so sciencey. Also, we're flexible around here on the Checkerboard Chat. And so we appreciate you guys tuning in. Sheila just made a comment about reaching out to a area Purina specialist. And I always take for granted that everybody knows that we have these people that are our Purina sales specialists out in the field. They work with any Purina dealer that, you guys have access to. They can come out to your farm. They can help you with your horse's diet. They're very knowledgeable. They have direct contact with Anna and I and our other nutritionists. So if you really have a need for a specific consult, contact your dealer and they can put you in touch with your specialist. And with that, Anna, any final parting words?
Well, I would say if you know of somebody who's got these kind of horses at your barn or your friend or something like that, and they're probably getting a lot of advice from a lot of different people, share this with them and point them in our direction.
Okay, well, thank you again. And if you want to try any of these feeds we talked about, if you're curious if your horse might do well on some of these different feeds, we actually do have what's called the Feed Greatness Challenge. It's a 60-day challenge. And if you sign up, you can get some coupons and kind of help you assess on whether or not it's the right choice for you as you're trying it out. So check out the Feed Greatness Challenge on our website if that's something you're interested in. And as always, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.